Okay, good evening, everybody. I'm Gary Rosinski. I'm the co-leader of the Boston chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby, and this is our monthly meeting for March. Tonight, we're very pleased to have Ezra Hausman to speak with us about energy markets and climate. What could go wrong? So Ezra is an independent consultant with over 20 years of experience in the electric energy sector, with a focus on consumer value and environmental protection, including mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions, within both regulated and deregulated electricity markets. His services include technical analysis and reports, expert testimony, resource planning, and economic analysis in the electric power industry. So welcome, Ezra. The floor is yours.
Should have given you the short version. Okay. Anyway, let me share my screen here. I have a little presentation. I'm going to try and cover things at a sort of very 20,000 foot level. Primarily, Gary asked me to talk about Texas. I said, oh, I have so many other things to talk about. And then Texas just keeps getting more and more interesting. So I will be talking mostly about what happened in Texas, not quite as much, or much less actually, about climate issues and the interaction of climate policies in the electricity markets, which would be another great thing I'd love to come back and talk to you folks about. But perhaps we'll have a little bit of time for that. So there's a rule, if you're do anything in the electric industry, that you have to start every talk by pointing out that the unique features of electricity markets, specifically that production and demand have to be equal at every instant in the system. So somebody turns on their light or plugs in their Tesla or whatever they're doing, somewhere more electricity has to be produced at that very moment. Now, I said in my slide here, I said that's dogma. And of course, it's no longer true. There's energy storage. There's, pump storage hydro has been around for a long time. There's battery storage, and bring up the electric car because electric vehicles are another area where a lot of folks, including my colleague Jacob is here. He's worked on some of these issues. A lot of folks are looking at how can you have vehicles act as to provide grid services to solve some of these problems. But the basic, paradigm that people have worked with for a century is that as soon as anybody needs electricity, you've got to be able to produce it. And how do you do that? There's just interesting factoid for you, is that as load goes up a little bit, that's a little drag on the system that causes the frequency of the system to lag just a tiny bit. And there are generating plants that are designed to respond to that instantly, mostly gas-fired plants, although it's a great use for storage, but mostly gas-fired plants that then goose up the gas that's going into the boiler, into the burner, and bring the frequency back up to 60 cycles per second, to very, very precisely. So I bring that up for a few reasons. One, because I think it's an interesting thing to think about how it works, but also because that is the role that we have assigned gas generators in our system, and that turns out to be important in Texas. The other unique feature of electricity markets that's always important to keep in mind is that it is just such a vital resource. We expect to have it available as much as we want, anytime we want. If it gets cut off, people literally die. They might be on a heart-lung machine or on their heating goes off, as we saw in Texas. So we feel like you should be able to have it all the time, anytime, but we price it like a commodity. And let me just go back to the very top of the slide. I'm talking about energy markets, which is to say the deregulated parts of the country, like where all of us live, where you no longer have one utility that owns everything, power plants, lines, billing customers, but instead you have as many parts of that as possible are in a market construct. So here we have this market construct, but it can't behave like a normal market because of this need to have electricity available when people want it at every moment. So what do you get? Well, in a normal market, if you had a shortage, prices would just go very, very high and demand would respond to that. But that doesn't happen in electricity markets, partly because we just feel like we can't let the price get that high. If that did happen in Texas, as we'll talk about a little bit, and people just get, hauled before Congress and start suing each other. It's just politically, it's not feasible to let the price get very high. And consumers, the ones who actually make the decision of whether to use electricity or not, every time they decide to turn on their light, don't actually see those prices most of the time. So for most of us, our electric bill is at some regulated rate. Our utility is eating the risk that the prices might go very high. Hopefully they're managing the risk through hedging strategies. But the consumers can't make intelligent decisions because they don't see those prices. And this is something that some economists that I mostly disagree with refer to as a missing money problem. That since we can't allow the prices to go arbitrarily high because of political problems or market rules, that means that the market is cutting off income that should be supporting generators and paying for that very high level of reliability. But we don't allow that. So there's some money that they should be earning that is missing from the market. So because of these kind of distortions that make it difficult to have electricity be a normal market, we have a number of regulatory interventions. And the number one huge one is that we have these things called RTOs. Maybe you all are familiar with this already, but I'll give you my attitude anyway. These regional organizations that run all the wires. They don't own them. They own the control room, basically, but they decide which power plants are going to be turned on and off all the time to meet load. That's called dispatch, that process of deciding what power plants will be on. And they run a market, the wholesale electricity market, based on that dispatch. And they use a system called locational marginal pricing, which means that at every moment, at every point in the system, they will say, here's the cost, the marginal cost of providing power at that point, and that is the wholesale price at that point. So that means that the price can be very volatile because it can be, if you have transmission constraints or generators that go out or lines that go out, the price can get very high. But again, customers don't see that. And as I have in 1C here, the utilities, which are the wholesale buyers, they should be hedging the cost through long-term contracting. Then we have something called capacity markets, which are a way we're supposed to make up for that missing money by paying generators just to be there. That's a very complicated thing that I love talking about, but not in the time allotted today, except to say that there is unlimited market power in these capacity markets. So you always have to have a market monitor whose job it is to report on whether the markets are behaving well, and then to go back and change things if they're not. You might put in your bids and they mitigate your bids. They say, nope, you can't bid that much for your power, or you have to change your behavior in some other way because the markets just aren't normal markets, and there's always opportunities for manipulation. Okay, what happened in Texas? Bad news. Extreme cold kills Texans in their bedrooms, vehicles, and backyards. And I decided to show this picture because can you frickin' believe the car that's getting smashed is a Prius in Texas? The only one. Look, across the street, there's a Nissan pickup. Fine. I don't know. Okay, anyway, serious disaster situation in Texas. It lasted for several days, but it turns out that the market failure lasted longer than the electric system failure. And that's what we're learning about now. And I'll talk about that in just a minute as well. But let's see what happened during the actual storm. And this graph, can people see this graph okay?
Yeah.
I hope. Well, I can't do anything about it if you can't. So this graph shows all the different types of electricity generation. So here's solar down at the bottom, actually doing just fine during the storm. Here's nuclear is this flat one because nuclear power basically doesn't change much, except interestingly, boom, something happened that there was a reduction in output from the nuclear plants. I don't know why that is, but you don't hear people talking about that. Coal, there was also a reduction. Some of this has to do with coal piles freezing, has to do with problems with the transmission system. So all these things went down. And here's wind. You hear, of course, the Republican in Texas and Fox News saying, oh, the wind failed. The wind turbines froze up. Well, a little bit, tiny bit of that happened. You see that it's a little lower during the storm. But wind, guess what, guys? That's its role in the system. I mean, should they have winterized the turbines better? Absolutely. They probably will in the future, but they don't have good regulations to force people to do that. But wind is a variable output resource. It's not the one that's supposed to be making sure the system's in balance. What is? Gas. And you've probably heard people say, oh, the wind went down a little bit, gas went down a lot in Texas, and that's absolutely true. But I think more to the point is you have to think about what is gas's role, gas generation's role in the system. And its role is to be the swing resource. So when the other resources can't produce as much or demand goes up, gas is the one that's supposed, in the design of the Texas system, we hope this will change, right? That storage will take on much more of this role. But in the current design of the system, it's the one that's supposed to go up to meet that increased demand. The gas lines froze. There was a shortage of available resources. Some of the plants failed. And so the gas generation actually went down. And that's really when the bad stuff hit the fan. I would have used a different word, but I understand this is being recorded and put on YouTube. We don't want that sitting around. Okay, so what happened to customers? Well, as I said, utilities are supposed to do hedging. They should have long-term contracts so that they are not fully exposed to these prices. So when when there was a shortage, forgot this important part of the story, when the shortage occurred, the market monitor said, well, we don't have any real way to set the price based on our existing system, because that's supposed to reflect the marginal cost of providing power. And we don't even have the power to provide. We're imposing these blackouts. So instead, they have a market rule that says, when that happens, if that ever happens, we will just set the price to $9,000 a megawatt hour, which is a very, very high price. Let me just put it in perspective for you. The price is usually about $30 a megawatt hour. So that's a factor of about 300. That means that you're paying as much for power in one day as you expected to pay in a year. Okay, so that is a serious problem. But it wouldn't be a problem if you were hedged. It hasn't really affected the cost of producing most of the power. The wind turbines are still producing power for free. If the gas turbines have gas contracts and they're running, their costs haven't really gone up. It's just that marginal cost is set at $9,000. And so if you're unhedged, you're in serious trouble. And some of these people who went to retail choice bought contracts that basically said, we think we're going to save a little money by going with the real-time price. So we're going to go, with our pants down, unhedged into the market as consumers. It's like, well, it's a pretty young crowd, but at least for Gary and me, you probably had oil at one point, right? Oil heat in your house.
Sure.
And the oil guys would say every year, do you want this contract price, or do you want to just pay whatever the market price is? Probably will be lower, might be higher. It could be twice as high. So, sometimes you take your chances and just be exposed to the market price. That's exactly what these guys did in the electric industry, but the electric retail choice, but they didn't realize that it could be 300 times higher and they would actually get a bill for it. So some of these poor folks who did retail choice thought they were saving money or whatever they thought, ended up with ridiculous bills like $16,000 or $17,000 for the month. And here's the governor saying how terrible that is. Okay, well, this document is actually, I was going to go through it a little bit, but I don't really have the time. It's a lawsuit from actually, I'm going to look at just a tiny bit of it. Let's see. New share lawsuit. Where is it? Darn. Okay, I can't do that fast enough. We'll just stick with this one. The municipal utility in San Antonio, Texas, sued ERCOT and all of its directors and the board and its officers, and basically said this was a taking. They rightly said that the same thing happened in 2011, and the ERCOT, which is the market operator in Texas, there was a long report that said how they needed to winterize the system better and prepare for these sort of things, and they didn't do it. And guess what? With climate change, these kinds of events are becoming more frequent and will become more frequent. So the market was woefully unprepared. But there's another thing that they did, which I alluded to earlier, which is that they made a serious mistake. And even after the shortages were gone, they did not lift the $9,000 price cap. So they kept prices pegged at $9,000 for 36 extra hours. And just in the electric industry, that's an astonishing amount of money. It's just billions of dollars. It was 20 billion. The transfer of wealth was like 20 billion, of which about 16 billion is attributable to this error. Now you might think, okay, go back and fix the error. And that's exactly what the market monitor in Texas told the ERCOT and the Texas Public Utility Commission to do. And they refused. They said, you can't unscramble that egg. People have settled all these transactions based on the price. It would just be a mess. Everybody's going to be suing each other forever. Then the governor weighed in. The legislature has just, at least the one house of the legislature has passed a bill forcing them to do this repricing. 2 out of the 3 members of the Utility Commission in Texas have resigned because they say, like, this is impossible. You're trying to force us to do something which cannot be done. Lawsuits will abound, and this $20 billion transfer of wealth for electricity will be matched by $20 billion in legal fees before this is all over. Okay, and I just wanted to mention certainly California in 2000, because if you think these folks were silly for being caught with their pants down and totally exposed to the wholesale price of electricity, the volatile price of electricity, what happened in 2000 in California is that a very similar event occurred. It was in December, but it wasn't due to super cold temperatures. Nobody really knows why it happened. I mean, it seems to have involved a fair amount of market manipulation, some by Enron, but there were actually a lot of players involved. And the price of electricity in California went up into the thousands. But because everybody who was involved in writing the deregulation law in California was so sure that prices were going to decrease in a deregulated market, the utilities were forbidden from entering into long-term contracts and hedging their costs. So when the price went up and stayed in the thousands of dollars for several days in California, all investor-owned utilities in California went bankrupt. They lost billions and billions of dollars, like, immediately. It led to the recall election for Gray Davis and Arnold Schwarzenegger becoming governor. It was just a complete disaster because of these dynamics of the way these markets work, this marginal clearing price markets, and the foolish strategy of not hedging against an outcome like this. And the last issue, which again, I just happy to talk about if people want to, but I don't have time I want to leave time for discussion, is just this really interesting dynamic that's going on where states are trying to have laws to support clean energy, including renewable portfolio standards, actually including subsidies for nuclear plants, and the markets like PJM and the New England market, these unelected people that like almost nobody's ever heard of, but that are incredibly powerful in controlling these multi-billion dollar markets, basically have said, no, those state laws that your legislature's passed, fine, but they're going to distort market signals. So if you have solar plants that are making energy for free you're not allowed to bid your actual cost in the market. You have to bid a higher cost. So in order to preserve the purity of the market. So that's why there's this weird minimum offer price rule, something you will never hear of in any kind of real market. So that is my whirlwind tour of kind of what happened in Texas and what can go wrong as we try and set up these so-called market constructs for electricity, which go into market constructs for clean electricity. All right.
Thanks, Ezra.
Open to
Let me ask
discussion.
you a quick question. Do you think that Texas has learned its lesson after being hit with this twice in the last decade, and that now they will actually, cost in the risk for events like this and require, for example, winterizing windmills, and taking other steps that are commonplace in the rest of the country?
So one issue with Texas you may or may not be aware of is the electric grid in the United States is divided into three parts: East, West, and Texas. Texas is not connected by any AC connections. There are some DC connections, but those don't count for some reason. Well, for good reasons. But so Texas is not connected to any other state electrically. And what that means is the reason they do that is that means they're not subject to federal regulation under the Interstate Commerce Clause. So even though New York has its own electricity market, it is electrically connected to many other states, and therefore it's federally regulated. Same thing with California. So Texas is cut off, and that means that they can make their own stupid rules, which they have done in terms of not having adequate reliability standards that would never be approved by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And B, they can't call on their neighbors when they have shortages. So that's another reason that they had a big shortage. So I think that system is not going to last. It's a bad system. It doesn't serve Texans well. It only serves their kind of like, Texan, I was going to say live free or die, but that's the wrong state. So, their kind of chauvinism of we don't want no federal regulation. And they really shot themselves in the foot with that. So I actually think that what's going to happen is they're going to become federally regulated. They will have to live up to federal standards, and they will get more connected because this just proved that it is just cuts it. They really cut off their nose to spite their face. I've come up with lots of metaphors for this, but that's what I think is going to happen.
Thanks.
I may be wrong, but.
Does anybody else have a question?
Sure. I also just want to share very quickly that somebody else who I spoke to referred to Texas being on their own grid as just like having secession in their back pocket at all times. So maybe that's part of it. But I wanted to ask about, so you talked about hedging and how some contracts had that built in, some don't. So for those who do have hedging built in, are the energy retailers then footing that difference, or like where does that money go, or is that like the missing money and it actually like may or may not exist?
No, that's an excellent question. Thank you. No, because again, as I said, this isn't the real cost of electricity. Okay, the $9,000 or even the locational marginal price, it's the marginal cost. So that means it's the cost of the highest megawatt hour of electricity that's being produced at that particular moment. So and so what happens actually if you're unhedged is that whoever's selling you that electricity is making a huge amount of money. So the utilities should have, and in most of the country do have, and the California situation was a notable exception, the utilities themselves have long-term contracts. So they're not exposed to that price except for a little bit on maybe 95% of their power they've bought under a long-term contract, and it's not exposed to those price swings. Some of that risk is priced into those contracts, but not much because, again, as I said, it doesn't affect the cost of production. You know, if they had vertically integrated utilities, they'd be fully hedged because they'd own their own power plants. But you know, a similar thing is to have these financial hedges where you have long-term contracts, and then it's just that little bit on the margin that you would be exposed to these fluctuations, and that obviously is much more manageable.
Okay. Well, thank you, Ezra. Really appreciate it.
Great.
You're welcome to stay on if you'd like to get a taste of how CCL operates. But I know you have your Peloton sitting there. It's all warmed up and ready to go. And we understand if you have to drop off. But thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been a pleasure. I'd love to stay on at least for a little while.
Sure.
That's okay.